There's a specific frustration when remembering an old piece of media and not being able to find it. Sometimes that's a song you forgot the lyrics to,
So it goes something like that.
or an old cartoon you only remember bits and pieces of. Usually, when one person has trouble finding a piece of media, it's a case of not knowing where to look. However, when it's something the public at large can't seem to find, that's when the media is considered lost. Lost media is usually obscure. Say, for example, an old Subway commercial that hasn't aired since the 90s.
Subway!
Sometimes this isn't the case, like the original cut of the classic sci-fi movie Metropolis, an extremely important part of film history that was only found a few years ago. One entertainment medium that doesn't seem to get lost very often is that of video games. A lot of lost media comes in the form of broadcasts, be that TV or radio broadcasts before the age of the internet. This is because if someone didn't have the forethought to record an event as it was being broadcast, you would have to hope that the broadcaster either plays a rerun or decides to sell home media releases. Because video games for most of their history have been sold physically, that hasn't really been an issue. Sure, physical media eventually degrades, but by then, it's likely someone has made a backup. While the age of the internet has, for the most part, made the preservation of lost media easier than ever, for video games, it's ironically had the opposite effect. Today, we'll be looking at two such examples: download-only games and live service games. Thanks to these services, hundreds of games have already been lost, and likely thousands more will soon join them. As many of you likely know, Sony's announcement of the PS Vita store closure earlier this year was a shock to game preservationists. Suddenly, with little warning, people had only a few months to catalog and back up any download-only game they could find in order to make sure they weren't lost to time. Eventually, Sony saw the online response to their announcement and decided to postpone the shutdown, but that won't last forever. No matter how far you push back a store's closure, the fact remains that eventually it will go down, and with it, so too may hundreds of downloadable games exclusive to the system. PS Vita is generally not considered a popular system, but this problem affects all modern systems. Eventually, more popular consoles like the PS3 and 3DS will be hit with the same type of shutdown. When the Wii's online store eventually shut down, it was only thanks to game rippers, moddable consoles, and emulation that allowed many classic games from being lost to time. But don't assume this will be a guarantee for future consoles. As systems get more complicated and console manufacturers put more effort into preventing players from cracking open their console software, the assumption that all games can be easily backed up, stored, or emulated becomes less likely. The Xbox 360, the console that really made downloadable games mainstream through their Xbox Arcade service, had dozens of games that are now lost to time. The Xbox 360 existed in an age where downloadable games were tiny, but as digital distribution became more mainstream, and as many games forgo physical releases entirely, the amount of games that may be potentially lost only increases. Also, it's no secret that more complicated and advanced systems often break easier than those consoles of the past. We live in an age where through emulation, either officially through modern consoles or through third-party emulation programs, pretty much all Nintendo games from the GameCube era and before are safe, even as the original hardware that played them becomes rarer and rarer. The issue is, ripping game ROM files from cartridges or burning CDs back in the day were relatively easy and straightforward. But backing up games that exist solely within a console's memory is a bit more complicated. Ripping techniques for these processes are different for each console and usually require a modified system. The practice console manufacturers have been putting more effort into stopping. Oftentimes, modding a console requires that system to have a specific firmware version or hardware version, which are often discontinued once the exploit is discovered and patched out of later releases. Without proper ripping and console modding methods, unless you were lucky enough to download a game onto your console before the servers were shut off, you are simply out of luck, and that's without mentioning how hardware failures and degradation will make these lucky consoles even rarer over time. The issue download-only console games have for game preservationists are a serious concern. Yet everything I stated so far is nothing compared to the danger live service games pose for media preservation. While dedicated fan bases and historians may be able to prevent the loss of many download-only games, after all, the thousands of hours people spent backing up Flash games before Flash was discontinued show that while it's impossible to save everything, most games can be saved if people care enough. This is not the case for live service games, which the majority of will almost certainly be lost forever. If there's anything that shows how poorly the video game industry treats its consumers, live service games is definitely it. I'm not talking about the loot boxes or predatory practices that often accompany these types of games, but instead the fact that when you buy a live service game or any game that requires you to connect to a centralized server to play, be that single player or multiplayer, you pretty much have bought a game that will eventually be completely unplayable one day at the discretion of the publisher. Imagine if this practice applied to any other medium. Would people have bought VHS tapes or DVDs if the distributor let it be known that after a given amount of time, all access to it will be cut off? Think about how many people own vinyls or Blu-rays because the idea of being able to own their media long-term is that important to them. Yet when you buy a live service game, be it physical or digital, once the developer decides to cut off service, there's pretty much nothing you can do. This practice has already affected hundreds of games, and will lead to the deaths of many of the most popular games currently being played. Despite how this practice puts a death sentence onto almost any game it's employed on, modern gamers, especially younger ones, seem to have accepted this practice. After all, you can't expect publishers to pay to keep a game alive forever, can you? The issue with this reasoning is that games, even multiplayer games, have existed for decades before live service games ever took hold. I can play Half-Life Deathmatch, Natural Selection, and even the original PC release of Halo online, decades after their original release, no problem. The idea that games need to constantly check in with a centralized server to be played is simply wrong, no matter how much gaming companies will say otherwise. The fact is that when companies make a live service game, there are several methods available to prevent their game from eventually dying. This includes decisions during the development of the game to make sure that even once a central server is no longer available, that core functions and connectivity still work. Doing something like that would have prevented disasters like the old Diablo 3 launch, which saw players not being able to play the game they paid for day one due to their servers being overloaded.
So I can't always play the fucking game when I want to fucking play!
Diablo 1 and 2 did not face similar issues while having online features. Another option developers can employ is giving your game a final update so it doesn't require an online verification before a person can play it. Yes, this will cost time and money, and take more time and money the more game logic is calculated on a centralized server rather than locally, but in actuality it isn't nearly as hard as you might think, with estimates ranging from a few days to a few weeks to get working in the vast majority of cases. Considering most of these games have been developed for months if not years, that small amount of extra time doesn't seem very much in comparison, especially since these issues could have been mitigated early during the game's development. The fact is, games aren't allowed to shut down because the poor publisher can't spend the money to keep a game going forever, but because publishers like having complete control over a game's online functionality. Diablo 3's online requirement was designed as a way to guarantee players would always have access to a game's in-game auction house, as well as making it harder for players to mod the game and give themselves extremely powerful weapons. This always online requirement, of course, wasn't present in the PlayStation version of the game, which allowed people to play the game offline cooperatively in the same room. You then have games like SimCity, where EA swore up and down that the online requirement was necessary because of how complicated the game was. It needed to always be connected to the internet to run properly, until a user modded the game to not need the online requirement, which actually made the game run far better. Publishers like the ability to permanently deny players access to play their games on a whim, either to stop who they deem to be cheaters or toxic players, or simply because the act of shutting down the game's servers to a past game means players are now forced to play new games, hopefully the ones developed by that same publisher. Publishers like the ability to permanently deny players access to play their games on a whim, either to stop who they deem to be toxic players, stopping players from giving themselves items they didn't pay for, or simply because the act of shutting down the servers to a past game means players are now forced to play new games, hopefully the ones developed by the same publisher. By keeping a game alive that isn't making them much money, they're being forced to compete with it when they release a new game. Think about how many people played Counter-Strike 1.6 when CSGO first released as an example, though thankfully, Valve didn't really have the power to stop them, or at the very least chose not to. While the vast majority of live service games will be lost to time, thankfully, due to the efforts of very dedicated dedicated fans, some games have been saved from extinction, even if doing so goes against the wishes of the game's IP owner. Through research, leaked code, or brute force reverse engineering, some games have managed to be saved. Take for example City of Heroes, the classic superhero MMO that was shut down in 2012 despite protests from fans. 7 years later, in 2019, it was revealed that a hidden private City of Heroes server was still running thanks to dedicated fans creating a server emulator. However, this was kept secret from the general public out of fears of it getting shut down by the game's publisher, similar to how Blizzard shut down dedicated vanilla World of Warcraft servers run by fans who wanted to experience the good old days of the game. Blizzard famously said no one would want to experience classic WoW again.
By the way, you don't want to do that either. You think you do, but you don't.
Then after, announcing their own version of vanilla WoW called World of Warcraft Classic. While server emulators have been created by fans to bring live service games back from the dead, this practice is extremely hard and requires both huge dedication and luck. So don't expect that this solution can save every, or even more than a small percentage of live service games. We now live in a time where many of the most popular games are either download only, live service, or both. It might be crazy to think about, but there will likely be a day when Fortnite servers go down forever. Unless Epic does something to prevent this, the modern generation of gamers will one day look back and think, man, I sure did love that game Fortnite growing up. I should try playing it again, and find out they simply can't anymore. There has been a recent push by gamers to fight back against the total loss of games.
Stop killing games. Stop it.
The idea that a work of art can be created and by design be lost forever is abhorrent. Thousands to hundreds of thousands of hours and upwards of millions of dollars have been put in developing these games. Developers spend years putting their heart and soul into these products. For their artistic, historical, and cultural value alone, games must not be allowed to simply be lost to time. The issue of game preservation is one that both involves consumer rights, the right to access the products they bought, as well as a preservationist and historical one. Remember the frustration of having a song in your head but not being able to remember what it was called? Not being able to find and listen to it again? Now apply that same feeling to a game possibly millions of people have played, yet will never be able to experience again. That's a tragedy that now awaits modern gamers, as long as publishers continue to allow it to happen.